All right, we're going to look at some factors about supply chain success. And once again, it's about what people do well and also the mindset as you're executing projects and what the procurement team are looking at for closeout. So really, I think from a supply chain success story, your desired outcome should be repeat business, client preferred status and automatic pre-qualification. And as I said, a lot of the big companies invest a lot of time in getting people on the approved vendors list, and I quite often joke that it's actually harder to get off a pre-qualification list sometimes than to get on it. Yeah. So companies spend a lot of money and time in their supply chain. So, once again, treat that with respect and keep trying to do the good things. Obviously looking for increased market share, profitability and sustainable growth. And I think sustainable growth is important. We have a mid-size earth moving company in Perth. They were turning over about $30 million per year. Chevron came along to them and said, would you like to build some things for us? And pretty much in a 12-month window turned them into a $400 million a year company. Now that company is pretty much going to pieces. A lot of their senior people, due to pressures, have left. There's appalling safety statistics. The whole culture of the organisation has been lost. So, it might sound good to the accountants or the bookkeepers to go from 30 to 400 million, but it's got to be sustainable. It's not just ramping up for one project. It's about making sure that your systems and your processes are robust enough to go on that journey. It's about saying no to the clients sometimes. What the procurement team want to see in the execution of your contract is proactive management. Now that's the top management. We want to see them invested in their organisations, in their companies, actually influencing and changing and taking ownership. Accurate and timely reporting, especially coming from South Africa. Once again, if you're doing things well, send some photos, send us a note saying everything's on schedule. A lot of companies think, yeah, it's going good. Yep, that's all right, we don't have to report it. But we don't know it's going good. We're on the other side of the planet, so we need to have that information. Vendor data on time. This is project critical. We don't just say we want a document in 2 weeks after award because we've got nothing to do. Your information we need to incorporate into other people's design, into the footings, into the civils, into the concrete. Quite often we lose a lot of schedule just because of late vendor data. And procurement people can be quite vindictive, and they will remember that on the next evaluation or when they're rating that supplier at the end of the project. And we'll quite often put that in our evaluation, that we remember this company was a pain to deal with when it came to vendor data and what an impact that had on our project. Make sure you get your supporting documentation in nice and early, your bank guarantees, your insurances, when your insurances are renewed, be proactive. Give us your contact list. I've had suppliers that we've sat down at the end of the contract, we're going through, we're ticking everything off, giving them back their retentions, making sure the vendor data and the manuals are signed off. And then I say to them, would you like to invoice us? Because they've forgotten to invoice us. Now, I don't mind the concept of a supplier not invoicing me, but it actually really affects my cash flow management, which is a big thing. We have the other extreme where someone turns off to a kick-off meeting with an invoice for 100% of their order, which didn't quite match the milestone terms and conditions. But try and keep your invoicing on time. Generally how an EPCM in Australia tries to manage FX is not to manage FX. They try and push it up to the client. So I'm executing a project in Botswana. I'm going to buy some pula, I'm going to buy some rand, and I might even spend some Australian dollars. At the start of the project, we'll have a really bad guess on where we think we're going to need money or what currency we're going to need in each bucket. And then we'll say to the client, we want to draw down money. So in May, I need some money from these guys. In September, I need this much from these companies. So when and that's based on your schedule, and that's based on your milestone payments. So if you don't put in your invoices, it really throws that out. And what we like to do at the end of the job, we say, well, we did this, and we did this, and we did this, and then we do one reconciliation back against that. So the client can hedge, the client can take the risk. Once again, variation claims, payments, invoices due on the 24th of the month. The 24th of the month, here comes all these variation claims. No supporting documentation, no advance notice. If you've got a claim coming up, let us know about it. Let's start negotiating and working on it rather than here's a claim and you expect to be paid for it. So it'll hold up everyone's payments. We want responsiveness. We want one contact person for duration. I don't want to deal with 4 or 5 product line managers who think their piece of equipment is the most exciting in the world. So quite often I've had up to 7 pieces of equipment placed on one supplier because we get discounts and it makes it easier to manage. So quite often we'll have this case, it's all been executed, In South Africa, there's one South African contact, and quite often we'll want an Australian contact person, someone sitting in Perth. So we can yell at him for 8 hours a day when things go wrong. We can call him into our office and have a go at him. Sometimes an organisation say, well really, he can actually just manage it from that level. So we don't care where it's been manufactured. We want one person to be held accountable for that, preferably in our time zone. We're paid extra money normally for that sort of thing, so we'll send someone an invoice for 5% of the contract Australian, 95% Rand, so we can be flexible in that regard. But we know we're paying more because we want that contact. Some of those equipment packages are our critical path. You know, I know organisations go through turnover, go through retention issues, go through change, but if we can have that one person, it stops having to retrain, re-educate them. Flexible, can-do attitude, solve problems like the motor supplier. And quality, if you know, once again, if you've got a product with a high technical requirement, you know, and you use an accredited third-party inspector on a regular basis, or they come into your factory, that's fine. But try to make sure it's not the owner's brother-in-law. Now, I've copped that a few times when I've been working in Asia, so just be careful of that one. So how do we measure if we've had a successful execution of the contract? We look at the total project delivery. We do a cost measurement at the end of it. So when we buy our red bicycle and we expect it to cost $500, we go, did it cost $500? What went wrong? Fabricated steel is a classic example. Who is supplying the fasteners? They always get lost and they always have to get reordered 2 or 3 times. So what can you do to make that, to improve that? Were the goods easy to pack and especially to unpack on site? The construction, the installation, the commissioning teams provide significant feedback. No one can whinge like those guys. No one can complain and moan like those guys. When they ring us up from site saying this doesn't fit or this doesn't work, that influences the next project. And quite often the construction, installation and commissioning guys are the mechanical and the electrical guys who are writing the scopes and helping pick the suppliers for the next project. So you don't want to annoy them. What's the quality of the surface treatment like? How easy is it to construct? Have you thought about modularisation? These sort of things. So we come to the project closeout phase. Your mindset should be about thinking about the next opportunity. Call a closeout meeting with the client if you think there's issues. Get some feedback. Were they happy? Are you going to roll on to the next project? I always develop a lessons learned register. I go through all the procurement issues that other disciplines have influenced or made difficult for me to manage a contract, and then I feed that through to the engineering teams. So things that they don't think about. You're looking to build those sustainable relationships. And a big one from your perspective should be to solve problems, even if they're not your doing, as they may be perceived to be, you may be perceived to be the cause of them. An example of that is fabricated steel. So you might do the best fabricated steel in the world, and you've painted it and it's glowing in the dark and it's 450 micron and it's perfect. But your contracted delivery point is X works. And then the transport and logistics company come in and they beat the hell out of it, throwing it in the container. When it gets to site, it's in terrible condition. Now the guys on site are going to think that was your work. So take photos, take ownership. Your lessons learned there might be, well, we want to manage transport and logistics of our product to site. Increase your scope, do your value adding. Recommend what's a good transport company to work with who you've had success delivering. So once again, it's not your fault that the steel got battered. It's not your fault that it has to be repainted on site, but the perception is your steel was rubbish. So when we get a phone call from someone in Germany saying, can you drive from Perth up to site in Broome over the weekend? That's probably the reason we don't. I think Western Australia is a very similar size to South Africa. And even for a Texan, we're bigger than they are. I think we managed to contain it in 3 time zones and they take 4. So that's the tyranny of distance. So if you're working on a project in Queensland or on the eastern seaboard of Australia, you have 0 opportunity to communicate with them because of the 2 or 3 hour time difference. So, you get up, they've already gone home. So that's the importance. Of communication. That's why we need reports. Population in WA is 2.3, about 1.5 million live in Perth. What's the average house price in South Africa? Anyone want to have I don't know the answer, just what do you feel?
2 million.
So 4 bedroom, 2 bathroom sort of house? Okay. 2.5. Okay. So do we have any answers on how much groceries cost each week?
1
So we pay about 3,000 for a family of 4. And you know, all the costs don't include all the good things in life like sport, hobbies and other interests. Now the reason I sort of go through that is because I want to talk about resourcing and cost of resourcing, and everyone gets really excited when they see lots of big numbers. But you've got to tie it back to what the actual costs are. Basically my household to run per year is in that sort of range. And I have 3 young children. I have identical twin boys who are 3. And I have a 5-year-old daughter. We live about an hour out of the city on a little bit of land in a very old house. So once again, the children aren't teenagers that are eating us out of house and home. They've only just started going into the school system, so those costs are all relatively low. So first, the bad news. The unemployment rate in Western Australia is presently 3.8%. That's because 3.7% of those people don't want to work and they'd rather sit at home and get a benefit and pay out from the government. Nationally, we're just under 5%. Now, apart from the spike because of the GFC, Western Australia's been relatively stable and under 5% for the last 10 years. What's the average or current unemployment rate in South Africa? 25? Yeah, Spain's around 30, 33. So what it does is when you've got that sort of unemployment rate, employees have a lot of choice and they can move around. So the following numbers we're going to look at on salaries in Perth at present include basically base salary, and then employers pay a 9% pension fund called superannuation, laptops, mobiles, any incentive program. So just to give you an idea. And when you're setting up an EPCM and you need an engineering manager, you need 5 principals, you can see the absolute cost of engineering in Australia. I always wanted to be a construction manager as a child, but the point I'm making is what's the cost of engineering in Australia? You know, why wouldn't you want to outsource to a South African consultancy to do your civils or your materials handling or your supervision? Plus this also comes back as a point of difference for managing a package out of Asia, where you might have to fly up people at these rates to manage and supervise it, or if you've got the confidence that the South African engineer can actually do the process without having to include people at this sort of level. So what I'm demonstrating there is the expense of setting up engineering, the expense of undertaking, and basically where we find our support for our projects. So overseas skilled and semi-skilled labour, especially from Asia. Overseas design services are pushing whole projects, whole modules out to the Philippines and India. A lot of sponsorships of foreign nationals on 457s. When I worked for TWP, over 80% of my project teammates were your colleagues or your countrymen. So people flying in complete project teams from overseas. But now the push has gone the other way because that's still got a big cost of pushing that work overseas now. Projects have been delayed. You know, Chevron moving from Gorgon to Wheatstone because of an ability to resource up. High staff turnover, so to try and keep people project focused on the Roy Hall project, which is about an iron ore project with about a 2.5-year duration. Once you join the project, if you stay to construction and commissioning, you'll get paid a bonus of $10 or 75 Rand for every hour you've worked in that 2.5 years on that project. So that's to keep people there. So once again, I mean, I did an audit of the Gorgon jetty when I joined a earth moving company recently, and I went down there, and in the last 29 months of that project they had 5 different procurement managers. So people come in, get frustrated, you know, don't like the systems, have a policy, do a few things and then leave the building. And that's the cost of a project. That can cause significant delays because you're constantly going over things, you're constantly rebuilding things. One thing, a trend in the marketplace that I really dislike and have noticed is signing on bonuses and spotters fees. So someone will join a company, perhaps a drafts person, and they'll get paid a signing on, and then they'll be offered a bonus for every other draftsman they can bring on board. So they'll clean out their last company of 30 draftsmen to get that bonus and basically wipe out engineering capacity. And draftsmen are very, very well paid. You know, during the boom, these guys are getting 4 or 5 big pay rises a year. And they basically name their own terms. A trend I've noticed, a lot of guys are coming out of retirement, upskilling, retraining, because you know they're topping up the super funds at the moment because of the ridiculous salary rates. Important requirements are to make sure that you have some system in place even before you start bidding. If you're moving into oil and gas, it's mandatory. A lot of companies, when they do their desktop audit, they send out their pre-qualification questionnaires, want to know what systems you've got in place. So you've got to have a proven and active audit program, both internal and external. You've got to look at complete product and material traceability, especially if you're making valves, especially if you're making cables, especially if you're making steel pipe. You know, It's got to be, everything's got to be traceable. Your personnel have got to be trained in your systems. They've got to be competent. So the quality system must address the system elements and activities appropriate to your product or service. So, you know, look at what you do. Look at who your client base are. Are you tackling oil and gas? I mean, you know, if you're making a valve and it's for residential, you might need systems like this. If it's commercial, it might be like this. If it's mining, it's like this. If it's oil and gas, it's going to be like this. You're going to have to spend 2 years pre-qualifying. You're going to have to do 50% batch testing in your first years. The guys will come in and do continuous audits on you just to get there. So do you want that investment? Do you want to get in that space? Think about that investment. So make the system relative to your business and to your target markets. Once again, there's got to be controls in place to manage your supply chain. The expectation is you're building something and you've got great systems, but is the guy supplying your nuts and bolts, is he traceable? Does he have systems in place? So thinking about your supply chain. Got some examples of my experience with Asian supply chain. Once again, I think, you know, and the point of difference is reinforce that you've got the quality system. So when we're doing the bid evaluation and equalisation, we say, do we need to sit an inspector in your factory? Well, you've got these systems. No. You know, do we need to send a guy to the Philippines to see what they're going to do, where they get the raw materials from? You know, $10,000. You know, that's your point of difference. When I did a project in Africa recently, I went out and got pricing on steel, and there was a different mix of steel components, and it's not so much the numbers but the scale of difference that's important. So landed to site from the Australian fabricators, it was in that sort of region per tonne. From South African or Southern African suppliers, landed to site, it was that sort of value. This is an African project, and this is an average of a number of suppliers, and the price coming out of Asia was that. Would anyone like to guess who got the order? And look, I mean, when I get feedback on that, the guys are saying, well, they're actually landing it here cheaper than we can get the raw material. So what chance do we have? So like I say, that's where you've got to value add, increase your scope, demonstrate your capabilities. Suppliers are expected to develop and submit a quality plan. That's a key document. Like I say, you know, with your quality manual, put through your table of contents. You don't have to bury us in details. An inspection and test plan is one of the key deliverables. And I really would even like to see that in the tender stage, just a typical one, because that allows us to plan the number of inspection visits. And as soon as we get that during the project, that's when we say, well, we need the third-party inspectors. So that inspection and test plan is a real key deliverable. Expected the corrective action processes in place and undergoing audits. And like I say, on big projects, or if it's critical path or it's high-risk equipment, if you're doing pressure vessels, then expect the client to come in 2 or 3 times. And expect them to want to go and look at your major sub-suppliers. So where are you getting your metal from? Is there that traceability there? So depending on the products being supplied, certain requirements for product certification, once again, inspection test plans must be actively managed. It's good to have the template, but you've got to see that process. So when our auditors, when our inspectors come in, they want to see our job being tracked through your factory. And there's some critical vendor data, which is the manufacturer's data report. And once again, that's something you can send in your table of contents, or you can send in your typical MDR at the start of the project award. So that way when you get to the job, the client won't come back to you, or the engineer won't come back to you and say, let's reformat that. So push that in early, just a typical document. Okay, so from an Australian perspective, or an Australian engineering perspective, what do you think their perceptions of South Africans are?
Good rugby players.
Always happy to hear rugby before cricket, so that's fine. Sorry?
Bad on paperwork, document control.
Okay.
Low skill levels.
Yep. What about your character traits?
Pretty hard working. Stubborn.
Hard working?
Arrogant.
Arrogant?
Stubborn.
Stubborn?
Pretty similar to Australians.
Possibly. So the general feedback in most people. So what are your perceptions of Australians? So what happens when an aggressive, abrasive, obnoxious South African sales rep goes in to meet an aggressive, abrasive, obnoxious Australian? Is it going to be a marriage made in heaven? Okay. So sometimes it's painful to look into the mirror. But once again, so I think it's important to understand that culture, that's an advantage. That can be a real big advantage, that, you know, there is the hard working, there is a sense of we go to impossible places that no one else wants to live and work and turn it into an operating field. You know, we have similar experience, we have the same climate, except I can't remember last time it snowed in Perth, but I've only been there 23 years. So it's that sort of thing. There is so much common elements. There's so much culture. There's so much language, so much history, so much sporting endeavour that's so similar. That's an advantage, you know. Build on that. But once again, if you go into a meeting and, you know, you've got your early engagement and, you know, if you go in there and I deserve the order because I'm all this, it's not going to wash. And as Neil said in his example, you know, he came into Sedgman and there was 9 South African companies and they all had their sales pitch and they were all perfect. And one of them came in and he had baggage in history. And he didn't declare that until about 3.5 seconds before the meeting. And so Sedgman's perspective was, we don't want to deal with South Africans. So he's not only tarnished it, he's ruined it for those other 8 guys. And the next South African that rings up for an appointment, bugger off. So you've got to think about that. One of my clients is a French guy, and he's recently relocated down from Singapore, and he works for an international piping company. And he called me and said, David, I'm finding it impossible to get meetings. He said, my accent, I think, is the problem. And he's got a very, very strong and very pronounced French accent. And he's copying a lot of just ignorance in the Australian marketplace. They'll hang up, he can't get meetings. So I said, look, I'll work with you. I'll try and help you. I'll do some introductions and we'll try and get you in the door that way. And I said, but this is a longer term problem. You know, you're a sales rep. You need to be able to work. You need to have this local engagement. I said, I think you need to speak to your boss in Singapore and see what he can do about resourcing. So he rang his boss in Singapore. And the next day he rang back with a solution. He called me and said, my boss has come up with a solution. He's sending me a German lady. Now I hope she's very attractive looking, because otherwise I think we've got a whole new set of problems there. So once again, that's someone outside the area making a decision and not really looking at those implications.
Where does his boss come from?
His boss is from the UK, and he's doing everything to clear everybody out of Europe. So that's his model, that's his motivation. But once again, it's about knowing that local conditions and what's going to work. I have a number of Australian companies that are looking to work in South Africa. I've got a concrete company that wants to see what opportunities are there. So if you're a business, if you're a consulting person, if you've got some product lines that you want to develop or you want some assistance, just drop me an email. Just let us know. I've got a lot of companies that want to come on board and work with South African companies in Africa. So there's a lot of opportunities out there.